G'day, Professor Joseph Drew here. A financial ratio that destroys businesses, distorts economies, and puts ratepayers at high risk. In this video, I'll tell you what it is, what we need to do to fix it. Yes, I'm talking about the own source ratio. It's used in New South Wales. It's a mandated ratio we must report on with a benchmark that's completely arbitrary and illogical and ill thought out. And this is a problem. When regulatory agencies set a mandatory ratio and a benchmark, people not unreasonably think that they should try to achieve this thing. But if the ratio is stupid and the benchmark is stupider, we end up with bad decisions being made that put economies and communities and councillors and councils at high risk. In this video, I'll give you the full details about what the problem is, but basically, it was a ratio imported from the US with no thought by our commercial consultant friends. That's where it was first used. And in the US, they have a completely different system of revenue. The argument there is that the most secure source of revenue is your own source revenue, because grants from different tiers of government are highly unstable and uncertain. So therefore, you're better off earning your own source revenue because you can rely on that. Now, the clowns that brought this ratio out to Australia didn't stop and think that, hey, hold up, things might be different in Australia. Perhaps we have a piece of federal legislation called the Financial Assistance Grants Act 1995, Commonwealth piece of legislation, which represents the bulk of our grant receipts. And that is legislated, and that is quite stable, despite the chaotic practices of most of our local government grants commissions, and it is actually more reliable than most own source revenue. Now, if you want an example, if you're working in local government, think back to COVID and think about some of your own source revenue from airports, caravan parks, childcare centres, sale yards, aquatic centres. Now, how stable were they during COVID? Compare that to your financial assistance grants, which were more stable. And in fact, you got them prepaid more during the COVID crisis. That should be a graphic illustration of how absolutely insane the own source revenue ratio is, but there's more to it. It gets even worse, so hang on. The problem is that we've had people like Mr. Sampson spruiking the necessity of making this ratio to be fit for the future. And the benchmark is set at 60% for the entire state. But that doesn't make sense, because rural local governments and city local governments have completely different remits, they do different things, and they have completely different sources of revenue. Besides that, we've got these financial assistance grants which have horizontal fiscal equalisation built into them as a legislative requirement, which I'll talk about in more detail in the next slide. Now, the outcome of ill-conceived ratios being spruiked by people that haven't bothered to think about them and don't have the qualifications to understand the full implications of them is that we've got councils going into business, deliberately going into commercial operations in order to meet this ratio so they can be fit for the future and not have to worry about punitive measures from the New South Wales state government. Now, what happens when a council goes into business? Well, you distort your local economy. So a council I'm working at present has 4 or 5 caravan parks, and the council's running a caravan park. Why should those private operators have to compete against a council that can quite happily lose hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, on an ill-fated business venture? Second of all, it distracts the staff from what they're supposed to be doing, the core mandatory services, domestic waste, water, sewage, roads, important stuff like that. Instead, we have staff running businesses. And the reality of the situation is that most people that join government, local government, or any government, don't want to be in the retail industry. If they wanted to be businessmen and be in the retail industry, they would have joined JB Hi-Fi or Woolies. Instead, they chose to join government because they want to help people, because they want to correct market failure, because they have values aligned with government, equity and responsiveness, which are completely at odds with the values of business. As Milton Friedman famously said, the only thing business is obliged to do is to make profit. They don't have to care about people. In fact, they shouldn't be caring about people. They have no moral obligation. Government is the complete opposite. So this challenges the ethos of staff and it distracts staff from what they should be doing. But also, the reason why there is a profit to be made in business is because we take on risk. So I own shares in the share market and I accept that I get dividends and profits because I bear a risk. And if things go south, I could lose my entire investment or I could be tapped on my shoulder to put more money into the company. Both of them happen relatively regularly. Now, my question is to you. Your typical ratepayer, Joe or Jane Smith, who has a little house in your council, are they aware that they're underwriting your risk? So if there is a problem in your caravan park or sale yards, or if council does something wrong and gets sued and has a liability, or there's another COVID or economic shock and we get no revenues but we still have the expenses, is Joe and Jane Smith aware that they will be paying for the business loss, that they are underwriting that risk? If they are completely aware of it, I've got less objections to it, but I would suggest to you that your average resident is not aware that your council is in business. They wouldn't be supportive of you being in business, and they certainly wouldn't be prepared to stump up the money if the risk goes south. And finally, local governments are notoriously bad at running businesses. You've got more regulatory hurdles, you've got higher wages, and you've got more important things to be doing. Hence, typically a local government will run a business far less efficiently and effectively than what a private operator will do. We've known forever, it's a famous dictum of Milton Friedman and just about every neoclassical economist, if you want to do something well, you put it over to the private market. So why on earth would we encourage local government to go into business and compete with private operators, knowing full well that they do not have the capacity, the mindset, the resources, or the regulatory freedom to actually compete successfully? And furthermore, as I've already alluded to, we have a Financial Assistance Grants Act 1995 Commonwealth legislation that enshrines in it horizontal fiscal equalisation, and it says that if councils put in reasonable effort, i.e. they charge sensible fees and sensible rates, and they're reasonably efficient, that they all should be provided with sufficient grants to allow every Australian, no matter what their postcode, to have access to basic local government services. Now, clearly, as I've said in other videos, that grant legislation is not being observed properly. There are a few little problems with the legislation, but the biggest problem is our chaotic grants commissions who don't seem to think that they have to observe this piece of Commonwealth legislation. After all, it is the Commonwealth government's money, but they don't seem to think that they need to follow the instructions of the people giving them the money. But we do have this HFE requirement in the legislation. And what that means is that your rural and remote councils should never be able to meet a standard benchmark. Because if they are meeting the same benchmark as the City of Sydney or Newcastle or any of the city councils, there is something clearly horribly wrong with our financial assistance grants, isn't there? Because the whole purpose of those grants is to give us more non-own source revenue to ensure that councils that don't have the capacity to generate their own revenue can indeed provide adequate services. Now, as I've said in other videos, the fags are completely chaotic and indefensible, and they're denying Australians across rural Australia and also in low socio-demographic communities in the city fair access to standard services, goods and services. As I say, most people in rural Australia are paying higher rates as a proportion of their wages as revenue effort, and receiving third world services because our grant system isn't working properly. But having said that, there is ludicrous and insane to have a 60% benchmark for the whole state when we know we have a grant system in place that's supposed to mean that that benchmark cannot be achieved by all the councils, when we know that rural councils do completely different things to city councils. It's just quite silly. And the problem is that when we have silly ratios and silly benchmarks, people make decisions based on those things and make really, really poor decisions, which put their community at risk and which put their council at risk. So I beseech the local government minister to please review the ratios. It's not just this one, there's another video coming up, and make sure that they've got some logic behind them and are responsive to the actual reality in Australia, because that's where we are and that's where the ratio needs to work correctly. Thank you very much for your time. Goodbye.